Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily chat show featuring the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. As we get towards the hot summer of 2024, we're beginning to wonder what kind of decade the 2020s will be and have been. It strikes me, it's hard to guess, of course, about the next 5 years, but two things won't be said about the 2020s. Firstly, people won't describe the 2020s as an inconsequential decade. I think it's very, very consequential. It's shaping perhaps the next 70 or 80 years of the century. And secondly, people won't describe the 2020s, unlike perhaps the 1920s, as a decade of fun, a decade which people enjoyed, the best decade. In contrast, though, the 1990s have been described as the best decade by Kurt Andersen, who's been on the show before, the founder of Spy magazine, wonderful writer. He wrote a piece in the Times back in 2015 describing the 1990s as the best decade. Andersen is a progressive. Meanwhile, a conservative, Charles Krauthammer, unfortunately died a few years ago, described the 1990s as our most inconsequential decade. I think it's because Krauthammer was rather offended by the antics of Bill Clinton. I know all this from an intriguing new book called Why the 90s Matter by my guest today, Terry H. Anderson, who's talking to us from a very hot college station in Texas. He teaches history. He's a former Navy guy in Vietnam, in the U.S. military. And Terry, before we get to the 90s, do you agree with my observations about the 2020s, that they're likely to be a very consequential decade, one where most people didn't have a lot of fun? Certainly, most people won't describe the 2020s as the best decade.
No, I mean, I agree with this. I think it's very interesting, but I think it's going to be very consequential. And it depends a lot on, of course, this election coming up in November and a number of other things. But with global warming and climate change, which we feel every day down here, folks, with that.
Yeah, people watching can see Terry has sweating.
If we don't start doing something on it right now, we're gonna be in huge trouble. And of course, this was known in the 1990s. I cover that in the book.
I wonder, though, Terry, whether the general misery does indeed reflect what's happening in the 2020s, and we might contrast with the 90s. There's been a lot of media about the US economy. Economists argue that it's actually doing reasonably well, but everyone thinks it's miserable, not just Donald Trump, but even Democrats. What was it about the 1990s that made people cheerful, have fun? Were they taking a lot of drugs? Were they having a lot of sex?
Well, they were probably doing that. But what was so interesting about the 1990s is it started, Bush 41 lost mainly because of the Great Recession at that time. In 1992, we've got 8% unemployment. That's a lot of people who want to go out and vote against him. Plus, we have somebody who's very interested in getting him back on track as far as balancing the budget. And that's a man by the name of H. Ross Perot. Plus, we got Bill Clinton. So we've got three people running in 1992. And one of the very first things that Bill Clinton does is he takes a couple of Republicans as his inner circle. And instead of giving a middle class tax break, which he campaigned on, what does he do? He doesn't give a middle class tax break. He raises the taxes of the top 2% in America. And that puts us on a path for his second term, in which his second term was the last time America balanced the budget. He not only balanced it once, he balanced the budget 4 years in a row. And if we would have continued on that tax plan, which we didn't, because Bush 43W got in there and then cut taxes for those top 2%, if we would have done that, we would have been done with our entire federal debt by the year 2010. That's what most economists think. But what happens, of course, more tax cuts and more tax cuts. And of course, now we have $1 trillion debt a year. I mean, $1 trillion, when back in 1992, we thought it was a lot when we had 120 or 130 billion dollars. Now it's $1 trillion. So the economy was screaming in the second half of Bill Clinton's administration. And not only was it his fiscal plan that was important, but also he was lucky, and that was in the sense that we had the .com revolution. And
well, before we get to what you
Okay.
call I'm not going to mimic your Texas accent, the .com revolution. Let's remind ourselves of the historical context of the 90s. Could one argue, Terry, that the 90s was always going to be in the shadow of a profoundly consequential decade, the 80s, which was, of course, the decade of Reagan? And speaking of tax, massive tax cuts that stimulated the economy, the American economy, the global economy, and also represented the foundations of our neoliberal age. So the 90s were the second chapter, in a sense, in the 90s of the 80s.
But there was a problem with that analogy. I agree that Reagan got the economy going again. And one of the major reasons for that was the price of oil went down from $32 a barrel to $12 a barrel. That was absolutely huge. And that, of course, also had an impact on the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So I agree that he did stimulate it, but he also did something else. And that was he deregulated the savings and loans. And when he deregulated the savings and loans in 1981, what we see by the end of the 80s is the collapse of the savings and loans, which is going to cost the American taxpayer a lot of money, and is going to mean that George Herbert Walker Bush is going to he was a traditional Republican. He was not a supply side Republican. And what he does is he signs a bill with the Democrats that actually raises taxes a little bit. And that's why a number of people turned against him. So we can see that in the early 1990s, we've got a crummy economy. I mean, you have to ask the question, how can a guy win Desert Storm against Saddam, liberate Kuwait? How can he do that? How can he bring the troops home? He ends the Vietnam syndrome. He has a lot of respect. This is when people start saying things, like thanks for your service, all that stuff. But he brings those troops home. He's got a 90% approval rating. 18 months later, he loses an election. How can that be? And the answer is basically the economy goes into the pits. And so that recession of 1992. So what happens? Clinton gets in there. He runs on the economy. He says, I'm going to get it going. And he instead of giving the middle class tax cut, instead of doing that, he keeps the taxes and he actually increases the taxes, and he gets lucky, and the .com revolution comes along, and the economy is fired up, and he balances the budget and has a surplus 4 years in a row.
I mean, I take your point, Terry, but I'm not convinced the budget deficits or surpluses really are that consequential, are they? I mean, so what? It doesn't seem to make that much difference to the 2020s, whether or not America's in debt. People would be just as anxious and pessimistic if the economy wasn't in a deficit. But let's leave that. Are you in you are, of course, Terry Anderson, but you in the Kurt Anderson camp, describing it as the best decade, or the Krauthammer camp as defining it as an inconsequential decade? Or how would you summarize it?
I would say it is why that's why I wrote a book on why the 90s matter, because I think it's a very important decade, an extremely important decade in which there are all kinds of things that happen that change America from a country that is rather parochial and to a country that is much more tolerant of all kinds of behaviors. This, of course, starts in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And we see three major liberation movements in the 1970s: women, gay, and sexual liberation. But that stuff is not out in the open so much. Now, as the end of the 1990s, it's all over television. It's all, I mean, people are using the F word on TV. This comes out in the 1990s for the very first time. Everybody is absolutely shocked. How can this possibly be? What's happened to America? And so what we see is anything goes America. Let's just take one example, and that is a guy by the name of Senator Hart. He is running for the Democratic nomination in 1988. And what happens to Senator Gary Hart from Colorado? People say, hey, we hear you're having an affair, okay? Well, Gary Hart says, oh, I'm the most boring guy in the world. Just, follow me around. And they do. They follow him around. And what do? They take pictures of him with his girlfriend who's a model, okay? And so they take pictures. He just got off his yacht with his yacht's name appropriately, Monkey Business. What happens to Senator Gary Hart? He is disgraced, okay? Now, fast forward. 10 years later, you've got Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. That comes out, okay? He denies it for 8 months in a row, and finally says, okay, I had well, whatever is, and all that stuff. And everybody just 10 years later go, who cares? Who cares? What happens when Ken Starr, the special prosecutor, indicts Bill Clinton? His approval rate goes up to an all-time high 70%.
Are you falling into the Anderson camp? I mean, I'm not sure whether you're celebrating this or outraged. I mean, presidents have sex lives. Before, the media didn't talk about it. JFK probably had more sex than any president in history. It's just, it was never really reported. Even Richard Nixon had sex. So what?
Well, it's
so in the 90s, people were a little bit more honest. Bill Clinton liked the ladies and enjoyed himself, and it came out, and the voters decided it was inconsequential. Why does that matter? And does that make it a good decade or a troubling decade? Krauthammer was troubled. Kurt Anderson is celebratory.
Well, I'm just reporting what happened. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I think that's up to the reader if it's good or bad. People, you'll still hear lots of people who absolutely hate Bill Clinton for what he did with Monica Lewinsky. Then you hear people, especially younger people, who cares? Who cares?
Yeah, I mean, I was rather envious, I have to admit, in the 90s. I was married, and most married men would give their left finger or their left arm for some of the things that Clinton got up to. But but again, in all seriousness, so what? So people are a little bit more honest about the sex lives of presidents. Is that really important?
Well, no, that's not what's important. What's important is that Americans, now, instead of being outraged, they don't care. 10 years ago, they were outraged by this kind of behavior. 10 years later, they're not outraged by this. So they're more.
But again, my point is this really matter? There are shifts in how people think about their politicians. We did a show a few months ago about the changes in public attitude towards gay marriage, where it was completely beyond the pale in the 70s and 80s. Today, most people accept it. That's just the nature of things. The public becomes more tolerant. And does that mean that the 90s matter, really? I mean, I'm not sure even about, does that impact, for example, how people think or don't think about the sex lives of the sex life of Donald Trump. Isn't that political as well? That
Well,
Krauthammer was offended because Clinton was a liberal. Liberals seem to enjoy themselves. And today it's the reverse with Trump.
Right. Well, it's the reverse. The point is that if Clinton could get away with it, why aren't people outraged with the Access Hollywood video where Trump will make these lewd statements about women? They weren't. Okay. This was because society's views on this issue changed remarkably in just a decade, the 1990s. So in 88, they are going to say, oh, this is terrible. Let's get rid of this guy. He's Gary Hart. And 98, they're going to say, oh, this is okay. Who cares? And a lot of people are saying, gee, like you did, gee, I'm kind of jealous. He gets away with this, you know? And so then you get Trump. And so what I'm doing in this book is I'm just demonstrating how American values have changed rapidly.
Well, yeah, I take your point, although I wonder if Obama had been caught having sex with one of his interns, I'm guessing the outrage would have been way more because of the nature, the color of the skin of Barack Obama. Clinton perhaps got away with it because he was a white politician. Is there some truth to that?
Well, I think if it was Obama, it would probably depend on the color of his girlfriend. But anyway, these are all hypotheticals. I know.
So okay, so we've got a new political. You've suggested a new political permissiveness in the 90s. Yes. Reflected by a certain Bill Clinton. What else happened in the 90s to make this decade so consequential in your view?
Well, I think that one of the most important things is technology. Okay, we've got a couple of things that are going on here that are huge. And one is in the 80s, we have a world ravished by HIV/AIDS. By 1996, 97, we have conquered AIDS. And this virus has already killed millions on 6 continents. It is huge. And so we have Dr. David Ho, who's going to win a Nobel. We've got people like this, and they are taking this horrible disease and they are making it, instead of a killer, just a disease that you can take pills. And you can live with. Absolutely huge, and that's one thing. Secondly, we also have Dolly the sheep. Remember Dolly the sheep? And this is, we are cloning animals now, so we are seeing medical advances very quickly during this time. Furthermore, we had computers in the 1980s. I got my first desk computer in the 1980s, but what do we get? We get the internet. We get the World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web we could not use unless you used Unix, unless you were really a computer geek. And then all of a sudden, Netscape comes out in 1995, and everybody realizes, wow, I can use this too. I can just put my mouse on something. And I mean, this is absolutely a huge. And what does this mean? This means what we're going to see is, instead of like 100 websites in 1995, we got 1 million by 2000. We've got so many websites that are all.
So what? I take your point, Terry, but so what? I mean, the AIDS thing, of course, is wonderful in the sense that it saved many lives. But when it comes to the internet, how did that change the world?
It changes behavior. It changes behavior. And by the end of the 1990s, we have cell phones. And how does cell phones change our behavior? I mean, it's absolutely amazing. You want to get on an airplane, you just go on the web, you call, whatever. I mean, you get rid of you are switching the environment and the economy around. It is becoming digital. And this digital revolution is just so important to our behavior today.
The man said it. The 90s, why the 90s matter. Terry H. Anderson's new book. Interesting thesis. We're going to take a short break. I know one thing that matters is the quarterly publication, Liberties, a quarterly publication about culture and politics, who support us and bring us great guests like Terry H. Anderson. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Terry to talk more politics in the 1990s, particularly the rise of what he calls the angry white man. So we'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with the college professor, Terry H. Anderson, the author of Why the 90s Matter. In the first half of our conversation, we talked about Bill Clinton. In the second half, we're going to talk about the other dominant American politician of the 1990s. Not Ross Perot was important, but Newt Gingrich, who seems to represent the model, the platonic version, perhaps, of the angry white man. Terry, were there angry white men before the 90s?
Of course there were. There always have been people who felt that they've been left behind. I'm just saying that it was more emphasized during the 1990s, and it comes to fruition. So why do we have angry white men? Well, one thing, we have a lot of them are Vietnam vets. They came home. There was no big parade. They were upset. They lost the war, okay? Or somebody said they lost the war. In other words, it wasn't like World War II where their dads came home. So that was one thing. Then all of a sudden they get home and the economy in the 70s is awful. The economy is in recession for, well, not Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter pays the price for this horrible economy. We got oil embargoes and we've got all. Then we have something else that's going on. And the 1970s is the great era of women's liberation. And that means that now women are competing with their men. And so a lot of men who, hey, my dad had that job, why can't I get it? This is also the period of affirmative action. They are trying to take people who are African Americans and who are women and get them into the jobs. They're not firing white people. I wrote a book on affirmative action. Nobody's firing white people. But when they retire or when they quit, they are looking for minorities and women to fill those positions. That irritates those guys' sons who thought, hey, my dad had this job. Why can't I have that job?
I mean, this is an interesting theory, but then how would you explain Reagan and the cheerful conservatism of the 1980s?
I would explain Reagan by the 1980 and the late 1970s economy. Okay, that's how I would explain Reagan. Furthermore, Reagan was really as he said, you cannot be, I don't know how you can be a president of the United States and not be an actor. He was really a good actor. Watch his speeches. He is good at this. I mean, he really knows how to give a talk. It was really good. Furthermore, another thing is he is a response to women's liberation, to sexual liberation, to gay liberation. He's a response to that, and he's a response to that horrible economy. And he is coming in, and people are saying, wow, it's been horrible under these liberals. Let's get moving again. And the businessmen absolutely love voting for him because he says he's going to cut taxes and balance the budget. I mean, it's a dream. It never happens. He increases the debt 250%, but it doesn't make any difference. He says those things. And then in 84, what happens? In 1984, wow, he asks, are you better off now or were you better off in 1980? And everybody can say now. I mean, oil prices have gone down. Those crises, I mean, the economy is good. We've got the Olympics in in his hometown, Los Angeles. He's out there with the Olympiads. Everybody, I mean, he looks tan and handsome and good, and we're winning. I mean, how can you go wrong with that? Now, the last couple of years of Reagan weren't nearly as good as those first 5 or 6 years, okay? We have Iran-Contra, we got the Pentagon scandal, but this talk isn't about that. But anyway, so he's not looking so good when he leaves office.
So would you agree with my suggestion that Gingrich, after Clinton or with Clinton, is the most consequential American politician of the 90s?
Yes, I would. And here's why. Because Gingrich had a take no prisoners idea about politics. He continually said it was a blood sport. And so what he wanted to do was as little compromise as possible. They came out with a pamphlet, and the pamphlet told the new people who came in who were Republicans, here are words you use against the Democrats. Say these words all the time. And here are words you use if you're a Republican. If you have somebody across the aisle, don't get to know them. Don't go to lunch with them. Don't befriend them. Don't compromise. Okay. And so this is the first great government shutdown we have in the United States. Okay. We had little short ones, like a day, but after a day, Reagan would sit down and they'd compromise, okay? They'd compromise, and so maybe we'd have a 1 or 2 day shutdown. But no, we don't have an 18-day shutdown. I mean,
was the 90s the period where we've had shows in which we talk about the way in which in the 60s and 70s, the Republican Party shifted from the party of the establishment to a party of the white working class, Southern working class, and the Democrats became increasingly the party of the elites. Was this in the 90s, the decade where the Republicans became the outsider party, even if they were insider, that they were anti-establishment, whilst the Democrats became the party of the establishment, the coastal elites?
I don't know about establishment or anti-establishment, but what happened to the Republican Party was that they realized while women and minorities were getting jobs, they realized that what they had to do was to convince the white working class who had voted Democratic, that they are the future. And the white working class shifts during the Reagan years, and another group shifts. And these are the evangelicals. They voted big time for Carter in 1976. By 1980, they are shifting. And by 1984, 2/3 of those are voting Southern Baptist. 2/3 of them are voting Republican. And that is because Ronald Reagan plays to the base. He understands this. The Democrats go, I can't believe this is happening. But there's one Democrat who does understand what's happening, and that's Bill Clinton. And that's why Bill Clinton doesn't run as an old Democrat with one social program after another social program. In 1992, he runs as a new Democrat. And a new Democrat is not going to be somebody who's got a government program for everything. He's going to be somebody who supports the police, who supports the military, and who is going to be strong on defense. So he is a much more moderate, compromising Democrat than a lot of the left ideologues.
Your book also does a good job explaining why the 90s was the decade, not of left-wing terrorism, that may have been the 70s and 80s, but of right-wing terrorism. You have a very good section on the Oklahoma bombing and Terry Nichol. As a former serviceman yourself, what does the tragedy of Oklahoma and of Terry Nichols tell us about the 90s?
And Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were in the military together. And what happens is these are people, Timothy McVeigh could not get into the special forces. And he worked like hell to get in the special forces, but he couldn't get into it. And so he got out of the Army, and he did fine during Desert Storm. He did well. As a matter of fact, he got a Bronze Star during Desert Storm. So now all of a sudden he's out and he can't get a job, and he is a gun collector and he loves guns, and he can't get a good job. He's very upset about the way America is going. And consequently, he starts to blame the federal government. He's going to blame the federal government for virtually everything. There are some people who just need somebody to blame, and it is McVeigh. And so what McVeigh does, of course, is he blows up, with Terry Nichols, he blows up the Oklahoma.
Yeah, I apologize. Of course, McVeigh was a much more consequential figure than Nichols. And you also write in the book about the Ruby Ridge standoffs and the shift in right-wing terrorist thinking to present the US state and the FBI as oppressors. And it's an important reminder. It's, again, very consequential in terms of the last 25-year history of the country. Things were, and your book reminds us of this, things were pretty violent and anarchic in some ways in the America of the 90s. Standoffs between militant right-wingers and the FBI, mass shootings, murders, huge suicides.
Yeah, definitely things. And that's one of the major reasons why Bill Clinton supported the assault weapons ban, because in the late 80s and the early 90s, there were a lot of shootings, but the assault weapons ban only lasted for 10 years. It was a compromise. But anyway, what we have are a bunch of very disgruntled people. McVeigh, Nichols, Weaver of Ruby Ridge. He's also a veteran. He's very upset. And these people are basically white nationalists, and they are going to go out and they are going to confront the federal government. And the federal government, they play into this. They do a terrible job at Ruby Ridge. Absolutely terrible. They send people up there dressed in camo gear. I mean, and then what they do at the Branch Davidian, Mount Carmel, outside of Waco, about 90 miles north of here, what they do there is the same thing. They say, this is not an assault on your building, and then they drive a tank up to it. I mean, can you believe this? I mean, and everybody's going, what is going on? And who is in the crowd there? Timothy McVeigh is in that crowd. A year later, he blows up the federal building. Okay, so these people are saying, wow, we don't have a federal government that...
Yeah, and your book does a very good job reminding of this. But when I was reading it, it occurred to me that, well, we have the internet today, we have social media, we have all sorts of violent language online. What hasn't happened is that the violence of the 90s continued in the first 25 years of the 21st century. Am I right? Or of all the McVeighs and the others, are they all now in their basements online on Facebook and Twitter, screaming and shouting against blacks and Jews and women?
Well, I suppose that's true, but we certainly have had more school shootings than ever in the history of the United States.
Although there were, you also remind us there are many, this was not the beginning of school shootings, but certainly a tragic 10 years when it comes to school shootings.
Yes, we've had a terrible, well, ever since the end of the assault weapons ban in 2004, it's been horrible. During the 10 years of the assault weapons ban, we only had one school shooting. That was Columbine in Colorado. Only one horrible one like that. But ever since, wow, it's just absolutely terrible.
Oh, hold on. Are you arguing that the weapons ban creates these mass shootings?
No. Just the opposite, that the assault weapons ban from 94 to 2004 resulted in only one school shooting,
right?
And that was at Columbine. Then you get rid of that law and Bill Clinton signed the Brady bill. Who was supporting that? Brady. Well, he worked for Reagan. Reagan supported and that's
and he was, of course, Brady was shot in the aborted assassination of
so
Brady.
Bill Clinton signed that. But we've got a problem with the Brady bill, and that is you can still sell guns at gun shows and online without background checks. And the result of all of that is, of course, it's a massacre.
Lots of angry white men. You've noted, Terry, that many of them had been in the military. They come back to an unforgiving America and an indifferent America. But you were also a Marine in Vietnam. You were in the Navy in Vietnam. You don't seem angry. You're a college professor. What were you doing in the 90s? Why aren't you an angry white man?
Because I was teaching at Texas A&M, having a good time. Writing books on the 1960s, actually. Yes. So no, I'm not an angry white man at all. I've been to every state in this country, and I've been to 85 nations. So I'm not somebody who's sitting down all night long looking at my web screen and trying to find people who agree with me. What was really sad the other day was a statement that most of this younger generation now gets their news. This is news, not fun. Gets their news on TikTok. I went, what?
And of course, there's a new book out, bestseller, Our Age of Anxiety. Was there much anxiety? There was a lot of anger in the 90s, but what about mental health? You didn't deal with it that much in the book, or maybe I missed that bit. Was it an anxious age?
Yes, it was an anxious age, and especially because of HIV/AIDS. Also, because the other thing that people
why did that make it anxious?
Why? Because everybody was afraid or scared to get HIV/AIDS. Okay, so everybody realized that, and this is the very first time that they start making condoms for women. Okay, and the country is really worried about HIV. Okay, because in the 80s, the first part of the 80s, it's just for gay people. Okay, and it's drug users. But by the early 1990s, anybody who has unprotected sex can get HIV/AIDS. And so, this is horrible. Also, there was another issue, and that was the trade deficit with Japan. As I note in the book, Japan is buying up America. They're buying Pebble Beach Golf Course. They're buying all of those huge Biltmore hotels in Los Angeles. They're buying tons of stuff because they're making so much money, okay, off American buyers. Now it's China, okay, but back in the 90s, it was them.
So doesn't that suggest that perhaps supports Krautheimer's argument that it was an inconsequential decade, because in the 90s, we got everything wrong. We assumed that Japan was the next great economic power, and it hasn't been.
Well, that's because China took its place.
Well, I think it's a little more it's a little bit more complicated than that. And another thing that you note in the book is the rise of the U.S. prison population. Yeah. Clinton, of course, is famous, remembered, or infamous for his sister soldier moment. Yeah. Was this the decade where America increasingly became a prison industrial state?
Yes, and there's no question about that, because of Clinton's enormous crime bill, which also was Violence Against Women Act and other things. But one of it is the 3 strikes and you're out. Okay, so what happens is if you've had a third felony, you could be put away forever. And of course, who were those people? Most of them were African Americans. Okay, and they found out that. And so what happened is so many of those African Americans were placed in jail for things today, selling marijuana. You wouldn't even be placed in jail for things like that. And so that made a lot of people very, very anxious.
And it's interesting. The more we talk, Kurt Anderson tells us that the 90s was the best decade. Anderson is one of America's most distinguished, credible, progressive liberals. But the more we hear, the less it seems like a good decade for progressives. We have the rise of the prison population, angry white men, right-wing violence. Why do you think somebody like Kurt Anderson remembers the 90s so fondly?
He had a good decade.
Well, he obviously had a good one personally, but I think it's more than that. Was this the last decade in which progressives were happy? They enjoyed themselves, maybe because Clinton was in the White House?
Yes, that's part of it. And another thing is the economy was so darn good. And the economy was fabulous, Clinton's second term, and everybody was making money. And the dot-com revolution, I mean, this is the rise of Silicon Valley. This is every time you looked around, there was a new thing that you could use on your computer and check out all of the.
Yeah, it's interesting, Terry, thinking about the 2020s, because the Dow, as we speak, is almost at 40,000 or just over 40,000. We have radical new technology that, like the internet, that's about to change everything. AI, more and more sophisticated technology on the biotech front. And yet we're more and more pessimistic. So the technology of the 2020s is just as radical, just as consequential. The economy in some ways is just as strong. It's just that we don't seem to be enjoying it.
I agree entirely with you. and people have asked me why that is, and it's very perplexing, because I can't believe, with the economy this good, with the way things are going, well, we're attacking global warming. We're doing a lot of good things. We're getting a lot of industry back in this country. We're doing all these things, and so many people are pessimistic, including my students. I asked my students, this is a great economy. What's your beef? And the guy says to me, $20 hamburgers. And I'm going, I don't even know in this town where you'd find a $20 hamburger.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that was missing from the 90s was radical inflation, significant inflation.
Right.
Which was a feature of the 1970s. Finally, Terry, it's a fascinating book and a fascinating period, and really interesting to compare and contrast the 1990s with the 2020s. One of the things you note in the book, which is full of interesting references, was NAFTA as the foundation for much of our current discontent. And that's one of the things that has made Donald Trump so popular. How significant was NAFTA in the 90s?
Huge. It's one of the most significant things, economic things of the 90s. What does NAFTA do? And it's bipartisan. It's George Bush 41 and it's Bill Clinton. Okay, it's bipartisan. So what does it do? It makes today Mexico our largest trading partner. Okay, bigger than China. It is huge. It has formed, with Canada, the largest trading bloc in the world. It has had a tremendous impact on Texas, where going across the border left and right, it's amazing. Furthermore, as far as migration is concerned, it also had a stipulation where the Mexican government agreed that now Northerners, Americans and Canadians, can buy land in Mexico. And what has that done? It has created the Mayan Riviera, Puerto Vallarta, all of these places down there where Canadians and Americans go down, buy homes on beaches. Baja California, I was down there in Baja California in 1969, okay, when I was a college kid. Okay, Baja California now is an American suburb. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing what has happened to these three countries.
But it was so maybe we should think of the 90s as the climax of globalization, or certainly the foundations of our globalized age, in which we're retreating from, whether it's Clinton or Biden. They're all now much more suspicious of free trade agreements, much more sympathetic to tariffs. So is that another major difference between the 90s and the 20s, that we're increasingly walking away, questioning globalization, whereas the 90s, there was very little, even the Newt Gingriches of the world didn't question globalization.
No, the Republican Party has changed tremendously. The Republican Party used to be the party of free trade until Trump. Okay, and so I think that the Republican Party has changed. Well, that's a whole new conversation. What's happened to the Republicans, but I mean, for a Republican president to put tariffs not only on China but on Canada and on Mexico, our NAFTA trade partners, no Republican would have ever even conceived of that.
Well, Terry, I'm going to ask you to separate your children here. It's certainly a consequential decade. I think Krauthammer was wrong, maybe inconsequential in moral terms, but otherwise very consequential. And I think Kurt Andersen's probably wrong. It was more than just fun. What is the most important reason for you why the 90s matter? You've just written this book, very interesting book. If you had to select one thing for why the 90s matter, what would it be?
The 1960s brought about a revolution in the society and culture. Then in the 1970s, it was extended and expanded. The 1980s, we see a lull. And then all of a sudden, the fruition of those liberation and cultural changes of the 60s and 70s come into being in the 1990s. And we get what I call anything goes America. Americans are no longer shocked by virtually any kind of behavior.